Good evening. This is Dennis Speed, and on behalf of Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche of the LaRouche Organization, I want to welcome you all to tonight's pre-conference conference call. We're launching a set of interventions, really one intervention, which has three components. And the first element of that intervention will be this Saturday, July 24th, starting at 9 a.m. in the morning. What we're going to be doing is we'll be doing a conference, which is, generally speaking, entitled "There Is No Climate Emergency. Apply the Science and Economics of Development to Stop Blackouts and Death." The conference will be in two parts, a morning panel and an afternoon panel. The morning panel is intended to discuss what we're calling the economic effects of green, mutual, and assured destruction, which will take apart the fraud of what's called the climate change emergency. The second panel, which will begin at about 2 p.m., is called Energy, World Health, and the End of War, the Power of Energy Flux Density. So the idea is that this conference, which will be this week, will be a polemical intervention into several different forms of lies about science, technology, and the capabilities that the human race actually possesses to give free, or nearly free, certainly cheap and abundant energy to the planet as a whole. Next week, on July 31st, we will be holding a special event which will be devoted to a new conception of economic and strategic cooperation in Afghanistan. And that will be spearheaded by Helga Sepp-LaRouche, along with a few persons that she's invited to speak together with her for that occasion. That's in 9 days. And then on Saturday, August 14th, which will mark the eve of the 50th anniversary of the ending of the United States initiated Bretton Woods system, which existed from 1944 to 1971. It was the basis for the Reconstruction after the Second World War. And it was ended summarily by a decree that was pronounced by Richard Nixon on August 15, 1971. From basically that point, U.S. sovereignty concerning its own financial and monetary matters was summarily ended. And the last half century, which has been largely a century characterized by useless, interminable wars and a general looting and constriction of the actual real U.S. economy. That process has now come to a kind of screeching halt, and that's what we're really confronted by in the combination of crises that we see today. And so we're going to be taking that up from the standpoint of the successful forecast of Lyndon LaRouche of that crisis. That was a forecast that resulted in the recruitment back at that time of many people, including myself, those of us who were either in college and heard Lyndon LaRouche personally debate this forecast with other economists or those who perhaps encountered him later. So what's happening is that will be on August 14th. So that's basically 21 days, roughly, not quite, but from the Saturday. So 23 days away. So we're talking about or looking at a 23-day process in which what we are intending is that this process catalyze a reversal, a kind of bootlegger's turn, 180-degree reversal of the self-destructive Malthusian policies, not only of economy, not only of culture, but a kind of a wrong-headed approach to the very idea of human evolution and the evolution of the biosphere, which is what the green plague actually represents. What we're going to try to do tonight, in part, is to shift one element of the conversation, because often, you can talk a lot about the particulars of the danger of war, and yes, that is actually an escalating circumstance right now. The dangers of the pandemic, and yes, as I think many people on the phone here know, that is also an escalating danger right now. The dangers of an impending financial blowout, and of course, when you're throwing trillions of dollars, even tens of trillions of dollars around, as the Federal Reserve is presently doing, that obviously is on a razor's edge. And you could get caught up, focused in that kind of bottoms-up approach. Or you could approach this from the standpoint of giving people the clearest idea of how the purpose of the human race and the mission of the human race in the universe as a whole, in some fashion, is expressed in our individual commitments to changing or improving life on the planet, both for ourselves and for our posterity. That there's a way to actually connect that broader macrocosmic question to our own microcosmic relationship to it. Because the fact that it's an individual relationship to a very important problem doesn't make it insignificant. It doesn't make it trivial. It's not that the actions of the individual need not be consequential in the universe. There are actually ways that human beings, individual human beings, as is seen in the case of somebody like a Ben Franklin, can take actions in their time that resonate far beyond their time and even for all time. Of course, the Christian religion talks about that continually. In one sense, that's the inspiration for much of what happened, inclusive of in the American Revolution. But it's also an important thing to recognize that physical economy, as Lyndon LaRouche understood it, was the practice of allowing for the creative actions, discoveries, and inventions of individuals to be realized throughout the society in such a way that they had a universalizing effect way beyond those generations in eliciting and advancing a general dialogue, not merely of the human race among itself, but also of that human race in conjunction with nature, both living and non-living. That's really something which is a kind of birthright of each individual in the human race, and that it's that we are striving to make the standard of life, of day-to-day life for the human race as a whole. So tonight what we want to do is, in preparation for what we'll be talking about in 2 days, have Megan Dobrodt put forward to us tonight some ideas that she's thinking about, both in terms of some things that Helga Sepp-LaRouche is recently proposing, specifically around Afghanistan, and more generally in terms of the larger application and implication of these initiatives of the next 3 weeks that we're going to be involved in. So, Megan, if you're there, please take it away.
Okay, I'm here. You can hear me all right, correct?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, what I want to start with and also really center around tonight is what Helga LaRouche has done in response to what Dennis mentioned, in response to the U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, which happened in the middle of the night of July 2nd without notifying the Afghan command until several hours later. And in the midst of the confusion of all of that, Helga's immediate response, which she later put into a statement, which you can find on the Schiller Institute site, which is called Afghanistan at a Crossroads, Graveyard for Empires, or Start of a New Era. And what she said is, this represents a major opportunity for humanity, something akin in quality to the fall of the Berlin Wall. A 20-year policy with obviously a background going back much farther, which I'll mention in a moment. But a 20-year policy has failed. Now, what's going to ultimately replace that policy for the moment is not determined. But depending on the direction that that goes, whether Afghanistan falls further into terrorism, war, and opium trade and drugs, or if it becomes the center, the jewel of a renaissance of development in Eurasia, both of which, in a sense, are equally possible today. That has broad implications, not just for Afghanistan or Central, Southwest Asia. This has implications for the next 100 years of human civilization. So that's what Helga said. Now, on the flip side, if you listen to or read the statements coming out of the United States Defense Department, the NATO commanders, etc., you'll hear things like what the British announced, which is that they're going to pull all of their troops out of the regional theaters fighting terrorism, what they called brush fire wars, so that they can really concentrate on the big one. And by the big one, they mean containing China in the Indo-Pacific. And then you had a similar statement from everybody's favorite warmonger, General Breedlove, who was the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, who spoke yesterday to a gathering in the nation of Georgia. And he said this, he said, as our current military engagements are beginning to wind down, obviously referencing Afghanistan, so we need to develop the next series of enduring military engagements. And then he goes on to attack Russia. So in other words, what Breedlove is saying is, oh, you thought we were bringing the troops home? Nope. We're freeing them up for the next big war. So where does this ideology of perpetual geopolitical war come from? This is not genetically American, so to speak. Now, obviously, there's a deeper history that goes back to the 19th century British Great Game, but the slightly more recent incarnation comes from British intelligence, which is kind of a funny term, but British intelligence, the tradition housed at Harvard in the person of William Yandell Elliott and his trainees, such as Samuel Huntington and Zbigniew Brzezinski. So Huntington wrote many tracts on the supposedly irreconcilable differences, conflict between cultures. He said future wars are not going to be between nations, they're going to be between cultures, specifically Western culture and Islam. Now, this led him to propose that the next phase of Western dominance of the world order would be in the form of an inevitable clash of civilizations, and he wrote a book of that name, between the West and Islam. And his friend Brzezinski, who brought him into the Carter administration for a short time, crafted the idea of an arc of crisis, along with his buddy Bernard Lewis from the British Foreign Office. The idea being that there's an arc of crisis stretching from Bangladesh to the eastern horn of Africa, and the policy was to intentionally foment instability in conflict, including creating and arming radical militant groups. Sound familiar? To use it as a weapon against the Soviet Union, which they did. It's that policy which underlay and was responsible fundamentally for what happened in the United States on September 11th, 2001. And that includes the factor that LaRouche forecast in January of that year that the incoming Bush administration was going to be facing the biggest financial collapse in modern history and would therefore move to create a situation in which they could seize emergency powers with a Reichstag fire-like event, very much as the Nazi Party set fire to the parliament, or the Reichstag, in 1933, I believe it was, and blamed it on the communists. So here we are 20 years later, and nothing has been done. And that policy has continued under Bush, Cheney, under Obama. Trump was not able to end it. And now we're a full generation deep into regime change wars. And that actually blows my mind that a person born at or around the time of September 11th may have been sent off to fight in Afghanistan. So what is to be done? What can be done in this situation? Yesterday, Helga LaRouche gave her weekly webcast. And in that webcast, she said the following. She said, I think if in the small, relatively speaking, namely in the context of Central Asia and Afghanistan, if there can be a collaboration between the United States, Russia, and China, then maybe this can be a bridge building whereby a completely different process of cooperation is put into motion. And that way, the larger confrontation, now she's referring to the confrontation between the U.S., Russia, and China, the larger confrontation can step by step be pulled back and replaced with cooperation, which I think is the only way humanity can continue to survive in this present stage of history. Now, I know that some people, maybe many people, see this as a good idea, a nice idea, but a practical impossibility. And it is from a linear standpoint, meaning there's nothing in the immediate past or immediate present that would logically result in what Helga is calling for. And that's the challenge. That's the problem we're facing. And the reason that's such a problem to you is that could quite literally decide whether or not we plunge into a new nuclear world war. And so what Helga's calling for is a conscious break, a decision to take a new pathway based on a completely new hypothesis about the future. Now, on July 10th in the LaRouche Organization Manhattan Project meeting, my friend and colleague Hussein Askari gave a very, very important presentation on the future development potential of Afghanistan. And I strongly recommend to everyone here to watch it or rewatch it. But the way that Hussein discussed Afghanistan in that presentation is he said, look, it is a scientific principle that the future determines the present. Now I want you to keep that in mind because that's what we're going to get into. The future determines the present. And the concrete image that he gave it is he said you have to look at the future of Afghanistan and you have to decide what you think of the future of Afghanistan through the eyes of an Afghan child. And then you'll know what its potential is. So what I want to do here is I want to get at that principle, the same principle of the reversed causality, so to speak, the future determining the present, for the reason that it's the necessary way to think if you're going to understand the genius of Helga's insight and intervention into this historic moment. But I want to get at it through a slightly different, maybe unexpected pathway, which, if you stick with me and if you allow the implications of it to penetrate, I think it'll give you a much deeper top-down, or I guess top-down is a fine word to use, a much deeper and broader insight into the process which is actually unfolding in human history today. So to do that, we're going to take a short tour into the work of a scientist, Vladimir Vernadsky. And I'll just say that I'm going to go pretty quickly tonight. I did give a slightly longer presentation at the Schiller Institute conference on June 26th, if anyone would like to refer back to that. So Vernadsky was a Russian-Ukrainian biogeochemist. He lived, he was born in 1863, so during the American Civil War, and he dies in 1945, the end of World War II. So he had quite a life. And he studied the effect of living and cognitive processes on the chemistry of the planet. So Vernadsky concluded through his many decades of studies that the evolution of life on Earth is not a random process, which I think probably goes against what all of us were told in science class with the Darwinian theory of random mutation evolution and survival of the fittest. And actually Vernadsky makes a passing comment of that, on that, lumping it together with Malthusianism. But Vernadsky says the evolution of life on Earth over billions of years has not been random, and actually, over the course of geological time, those billions of years, evolution has gone in a definite direction. Perhaps it paused for several millennia in its progress, but it has never gone backwards. So what I want to do is I want to offer as succinctly as I can two views of that process described by Vernadsky. The first is going to be that of an American mineralogist, geologist, zoologist named James Dwight Dana. And then I'll circle back to Vernadsky himself. So Dana is a really fascinating person who made many, many contributions to science, including the first significant study of the Hawaiian volcanoes. He has formations named after him on the moon and Mars, and many other things. What I want to tell you about tonight is some of his work on evolution. So Dana is actually cited with great admiration by Vernadsky as contributing to evolution the concept of cephalization. So the word cephalization comes from the Greek word for head. And cephalization as a concept is the idea that over the course of evolutionary time, across all categories of life, the succession of biological forms, the succession of body structure of living things has moved away from serving the needs of mere locomotion, and it's moved toward serving the needs of the brain and eventually the mind. So Dana studied numerous categories of animals. He studied aquatic creatures like jellyfish, crustacea. He studied insects. He studied land animals like reptiles and mammals. And he notes that if you look at very primitive ancient invertebrates, creatures like our modern-day jellyfish are a representation of that. Jellyfish have radial symmetry, meaning they don't really have a front and a back. Their nervous systems are very loose neural nets, which are distributed loosely throughout their bodies. They have very limited control over their sense responses and direction. Later, more evolved creatures, for example, some of the earlier crustacea, they actually have more consolidated nervous systems, primitive brains. They have limbs and also the majority of their body in the form of usually tail structures dedicated to locomotion, but it's locomotion in a particular direction. And then even later appearances of crustacea like crabs and so forth, more of their body structure is dedicated to and oriented not so much around locomotion, but around the anterior, around the head. Okay, so maybe you're thinking, why are you talking about crabs here? You'll see. So Dana said, okay, then you start to look at mammals. So mammals are already leaps and bounds ahead of these little sea creatures by the fact that mammals, also reptiles, have a centralized nervous system protected by a spinal column with much greater control over their sense responses. But if you take mammals, you can look at the progression from the four-footed animals with relatively smaller brains, whose bodies are organized more around locomotion, and then you start to move kind of upwards, so to speak, to the monkeys, to the higher apes, whose forelimbs are partially for getting around, but partially for interacting with and manipulating their environments, including feeding themselves, but more interestingly, in the case of higher apes, the ability to use tools, to use sign language, to interact and communicate in their environment. And so Dana said over time, across all the categories of living forms that he studied, the head and the brain really, but the head has taken a more and more prominent place anatomically. And the rest of the body, from the nervous system to the limbs, has come to be organized to serve its needs. Now he said cephalization, this process, reaches its pinnacle in human beings. Not only do we walk completely upright with our entire body supporting the head, but our limbs are used to serve things like our scientific work, operate machinery and manufacture, writing, playing the piano, conducting an orchestra. Beyond that, take the senses. Now, obviously, certain animals have much more highly developed senses than human beings, but human beings use our senses in a way in which no animal does. And that is, and I'll give the proviso that this is in the case of a healthy culture, that is that we're not slaves to our senses. We're not just recipients of our sense impressions. We shape our sense impressions, and by that I mean not only our, born in the box 5 senses, but also the ones that we create, like magnetometers, X-ray telescopes. Those senses we bring about to serve the needs of our investigative minds. And so from Dana, we have a very fascinating and important discovery in evolution, which shows that even though earlier organisms didn't have minds themselves, and some of them didn't even really have brains, despite that, if you look over the whole sweep of evolution, it seems to be that the history of evolution as a whole was striving to create a form which could finally support the function of a creative mind. So that future necessity of a creative being such as us seems to have been demanding the kind of evolutionary changes that took place over many billions of years. Okay, so that's Dana. Now, I want to add to this another dimension from the work of Vernadsky. So Vernadsky said, I mentioned Vernadsky was a biogeochemist. And Vernadsky said, look, when you study living things, you have to get rid of the idea that a living thing is a thing. And you have to look at it with the eyes of a chemist. And from that standpoint, what you call the living thing is actually a living mineral, meaning a living body, be it you or an amoeba or your pet cat, has a very precise and unique distribution of chemical elements that make up its body that's specific to that species of life. So, for example, I just pulled a couple of numbers here. In the human body, by mass, oxygen is 65% of the mass of your body. Carbon is 18.5%. Hydrogen is 9.5%. Nitrogen is 3.2% of the human body. And all of the rest of the elements combined make up that remaining 3.8%. So in a sense, that's the chemical fingerprint of the human mineral. But those atoms of oxygen and carbon and so forth that are in your body right now as we speak, those atoms aren't necessarily going to be there tomorrow. And within a year from today, 98% of the stuff that you would call your body and think you're touching in your body, 98% of those atoms will have been passed out of your body and replaced with new ones. So you'll be made up of completely different material, 100% different material 5 years from now than you are today. And that's true of all living things. And this process of changeover occurs through nutrition and respiration. So in that sense, you, or a living being as a living mineral, is constantly in motion, taking in material from the surrounding environment. Sometimes while it's in our bodies, we turn it into new chemical compounds that don't exist outside of life. And then we release them back into the environment. And so Vernadsky cites, I think it's Georges Cuvier, who said that a living thing is really more like a very slow whirlpool of material than it is a fixed, solid thing. Now, by this process of exchange of material and transformation of material, over billions of years, life has radically changed the environment of Earth, including the atmosphere, and has made, in doing that, the effect has been that life's changes to the environment have made it more capable of supporting higher forms of life. And Vernadsky found that over time, the rate at which living forms are transforming the environment by this exchange of materials has only increased, meaning that the set of species alive today are changing the environment, are moving the atoms of the earth through their bodies faster than more ancient species. And he says that it's the organisms which can't keep up with that rate of motion or activity, which go extinct or decline. Now, when human beings came on the scene, we get something completely new, which is a species of life which certainly exchanges and transforms the material of the earth, but we don't really do it through our bodies, not in a significant way anyway. And I think here's where I want you to start to bring back Dana's work into your mind. Our bodies haven't really changed very much over the past 10,000, 20,000 years, maybe more. And our brains haven't really changed very appreciably. But we are a completely different species today, effectively, than we were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and certainly thousands of years ago. Why? Did our bodies change? No. Our ideas sure have changed. Human beings evolve through discovering more and more truthful ideas, principles of nature, which have enabled us to change nature when we apply them at greater and greater rates through technologies that we invent, even to the point that now we're capable of bringing not just ourselves but other forms of life off of the planet Earth, which life never could have done without us. So both Vernadsky and Dana concluded that, in a sense, a very real sense, human beings are the culmination or the end point in a certain way of biological evolution. And while the entirety of evolution has vectored toward the creation of mankind, we are not simply biological. And here's something Vernadsky said about this. And he's going to use the term cultural biogeochemical energy. What he means is the means by which human beings transform the planet through our technology and our organized labor, right? The fact that, you think about it, it actually takes a whole nation's economy to produce the machinery that, for example, the mining machinery that you use to dig up stuff in the earth. So that's what he means by cultural biogeochemical energy. So he says, the creation on our planet of cultural biogeochemical energy appears to be a fundamental fact of its geological history. The way was prepared in the course of all geological time. The fundamental determining process here is the maximum expression of the human mind. Now, so we have Dana, we have Vernadsky. The insight that Lyndon and Helga LaRouche bring to this is that the way in which our species avoids extinction, if you want to put it negatively, or to put it positively, the way in which our species continues to evolve and develop to higher states is that we overthrow our bad ideas and leave them behind. And we do that by choosing to adopt ideas, concepts that are more in line with natural law. That's a process of discovery. It's a process of moral courage. And it's a process of artistic imagination and the organization of the population to discover that principle. That is a willful process, not an automatic one. So I have a quote of Vernadsky I was planning to end with, but I think I'm actually just going to summarize it. So in 1938, Vernadsky finished a book-length work, which is called Scientific Thought as a Planetary Phenomenon. So 1938, just remind yourself of what was occurring on the continent of Eurasia in 1938. And again, I'm summarizing, not reading, but I want you to listen for Vernadsky's optimism. So he says, look, the entire scope of the development of the human species has led to the point where now we have the ability to eliminate famine, to eliminate poverty, and what it's going to take is a willful decision to organize our activity around, to recognize the unified nature of mankind, and to organize and plan our activity as a species to promote the mastery of nature and the just distribution of wealth, which recognizes the equality of all people. And he says, the struggle to achieve this might last 2 to 3 generations, but given the increasing rate of progress, I think it might take even less. So you imagine him saying that in 1938. So I think we should reflect on that and reflect on what Helga LaRouche is intervening with in the strategic situation today, into this civilizational crisis, and consider why Helga is so insistent that the situation around Afghanistan represents the potential for an upward evolutionary step for humanity to create a future which doesn't exist in the present. And I want you to consider what your role in that should be.